Welcome, everyone. We are excited to have you joining us today for Chart Chat. Welcoming to the stage all of my wonderful co-hosts here today and our guest speaker for sharing some insights about practical charts. I am Amanda Makulec. I am a data visualization designer based in Washington, D.C., who volunteers as the executive director for the Global Data Visualization Society. And I'll do a round of introductions first, running around the table, landing last on our special guest today. So Andy, let me hand it over to you to say hello to everyone joining us.
Hello, everybody. Andy Cotgreave, Senior Data Evangelist at Tableau, co-author of the Big Book of Dashboards. I think since we last did Chart Chat, I passed my 12-year anniversary at Tableau. Boom. There you go. Over to Steve. Steve is on mute.
Steve is on mute.
I knew that.
You knew that? All right.
Steve
We've
Wexler.
only done it 45 times.
Yeah, I know. I'm the chief chart looker-atter at Data Revelations, along with Andy and Jeff, one of the co-authors of the Big Book of Dashboards. I am the author of The Big Picture, an occasional sparring partner of Amanda, Andy, Jeff, and now, and again, Nick. Looking forward to the discussion today, and let me pass things over to Jeff.
Hey, Jeff Shaffer here from Cincinnati, where I am the professor at the University of Cincinnati. My second year is full-time, and I am also the VP of IT and Analytics for a fintech here in Cincinnati, Ohio. Thank you very much. Back to Amanda.
Wonderful. And we're excited to have Nick here today. Nick, we've had on Chart Chat pop up and some conversations in the past, I think. But today we all get to have the great, wonderful experience of getting to read and take a peek at his book. Coming out soon. Nick, when does the book come out?
November 15th.
November 15th. So bringing Nick on to talk about this topic of practical charts. So Nick, do you want to give us a quick introduction to yourself and your book, and where are you joining us from today?
Sure. Yeah. So you are correct. That is pronounced Nick Deborah. Congratulations. You got that one correct. It's not an easy one. I'm basically an independent educator and consultant, and now an author as of very recently. I teach data visualization and dashboard design. I've taught all over the world at NASA and Bloomberg and Visa and lots of different places. I am based in balmy Ottawa, Canada, where it is finally a normal temperature after soaring temperatures last week. It's crazy.
Not so balmy anymore. So excited to go ahead and welcome our various different people from around the world, both folks who are joining us live and folks who are joining us and watching the recording. Today, we're talking about not just chit chat, but chart chat, all about the interesting nuances and ways in which we create great data visualizations. Today, focusing on practical things, practical charts. You are encouraged as live participants to join our debate. We hope you'll join us at this water cooler or bird bath in this photo and bring your conversation into the fold as we go ahead and dive into some sticky topics and debates within the data viz world. You're welcome to add your own questions, your comments, any insights you might have on these topics into the chat box, and we'll keep an eye on those and try to bring those up onto the stage where we can. We also encourage you to join the after party, which is a 30-minute session where we hop on a Zoom meeting and give all of you a chance to ask your own questions of Nick and us as co-hosts and dive into these topics in a new way. So hope you'll join us for the after party. Today's topics, we're going to talk about three key things like we usually do, starting off with taxonomies, chart taxonomies, and decision trees. What is their role in chart selection? And maybe some of the debates about their merits as a tool for guidance and building mental models compared to being a tool that might constrain our thinking. Second, we'll talk about inset plots. If you're not familiar with what an inset plot is, our guest will be sharing a bit of insight about inset plots and how and when and why we might use them. And last, diving into box plots, looking at ways in which we might use box plots or not, and alternates to the box plot, and some of the debate about their merits as a chart for reporting different kinds of statistical findings. As we dive into those three different interesting topics, we hope we'll still have time to dig into our lightning round and bring up a couple different examples of great work in the data viz field and great examples of visualization that we've seen out in the world over the course of the last month since you last joined us for Chart Chat. So let's go ahead and dive into chart taxonomies and the world of chart taxonomies and some of the debates within the data viz field about taxonomies and how we use them. I'm going to tee up a few just examples to make sense of what a taxonomy is when we talk about chart taxonomies. and then hand it over to Nick to give a little bit of perspective on the ways in which he uses taxonomies and decision trees, both in his book and in how he teaches data visualization, and see if we can resolve the question, or maybe not, around how useful they are. So as we think about chart taxonomies, one of the first taxonomies I encountered, this kind of taxonomy, or really a decision tree in this case, was around looking at asking a question of what kind of analysis you're trying to show, and then diving down into what different kinds of charts may be well suited for that analysis. I think this chart starter popped up on my radar. I mean, when I first started dabbling in better understanding the world of data viz back in 2012. And since then, there have been a great evolution in other chart taxonomies that are perhaps a bit more sophisticated and complex. Maybe that's good, maybe that's not. So as we think about chart taxonomies these days, one of the ones that often pops up is the Financial Times' visual vocabulary. It's created as both a static poster or PDF and look at that looks across various kinds of analyses, thinking about representing rankings or part to whole comparisons, and then showing different kinds of charts that may be well suited in that case. They do also have an interactive version that I believe built in Tableau, where you can see how to build each of these individual chart types in Tableau, and an accompanying version was made in Power BI. So you can actually see how to build these various different charts in different tools. There's also interactive ways that we present these kind of taxonomies or decision trees, and ways of organizing charts into categories and classifications. And here on this example here from the DataViz project, you can actually search and look for different chart types based on things like shape or function or input or family. And shape is an interesting one that if you want to go look at all of the different circular shaped charts that are out there, this will give you a nice summary of what those might be. So it's an interesting different way of allowing you to explore different chart types. And exploring these kind of tools can be really valuable, especially if you're new to data visualization and what that looks like. So I also find that chart taxonomy posters can be really nice for taking pictures of your kids or babies. They're very pretty to hang on your wall. They're lovely. I don't always find them to be a useful tool for me these days in my work, because I feel like I've built my own mental models of what some of these taxonomies are. But what I like about what Nick has done in his book and what he's done in some of his writing is he's actually pointed to the ways in which you can use these more granular flows or decision trees to think about how to answer a specific question. Not saying what chart should I use overall, but rather thinking about how do I choose a chart type for a very specific function or purpose. And as we think about how that feeds into the broader world of how we think about taxonomies and decision trees, I was heartened back to an article we did in Nightingale at the very beginning, where it went back to a debate we had in the data viz world inside of DVS, where Alberto Cairo called up the fact that apparently Leland Wilkinson, who we have a lot of respect for, said that taxonomies of charts are harmful. And I'm not sure I agree with that. I think that there is good and bad in terms of how we might use them. But Alberto called this up, and it was part of a larger, longer conversation, an article that we wrote summarizing a lot of thoughts about taxonomies. When we think about taxonomies, I think sometimes they can, one of the debates in this conversation within DVS was they can constrain our thinking. And if we go down the route of iteration and innovation, we can take something like a single data set. Ferdio did this as part of their one data set 100 visualizations project. And they took a simple data table, you see it here, with only 6 values. And they created 100 different charts. This is about the first 50 of them, using that simple data set. And they didn't have a key analysis finding or something they were looking to present, but it gives a nice clue into the ways in which, without any constraints on our thinking, we are able to do a lot of things, even with a small and simple data set. Now, that might not be great if we're trying to focus in on a specific analysis finding or goal. But as we think about how these kind of tools get used and how taxonomies get used, they're sometimes pointed to as a thing that constrains our thinking, that keeps us focused on there being 1 or 2 or 5 different solutions to one need or analysis goal. So as we see here, this is a beautiful way that StreamYard has rendered our lovely Google Slides, but I think that there's an interesting debate in terms of the ways in which we use taxonomies. So there's the idea that we can use taxonomies either as a way to allow us to be, as someone said in our article on Medium, taxonomies allowing us to actually be lazy and not have to think as much in data visualization design. Or taxonomies can be really useful for allowing us to have mental models and structures that guide people, especially new folks in the data viz field, on how they can go ahead and they can actually make sense of and make decisions about what charts to use in different cases. So in the world of this kind of either or, and maybe it's an and, our taxonomy is a tool that make us more lazy in our chart selection and in our design processes and constrain innovation. Or our taxonomy is a really enabling tool in different ways that help us build mental models of what charts to use in different contexts. That's the question I want to put out to my chart chat chums and to Nick. And Nick, wondering if you might have any specific examples you want to bring up in terms of some of the decision trees or taxonomy approaches you've used in your teaching and in your book to help to make sense of a lot of these kind of big questions around how we choose which chart to use.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to kind of set the stage, because you're right. I think those are key questions that a lot of people kind of wonder about, and my perspective is certainly informed by what I do day to day, which is basically teach data visualization to people with a very wide array of different sort of levels of expertise and background, and oftentimes they're just getting started, and so I think that's where one of the main roles that I see for these kinds of decision trees and taxonomies is to get people kind of off the ground when they're sort of starting from zero. Like, I really like that example that you just showed a few moments ago of, here's like 6 values and literally 100 ways of showing them. And so when you show that to somebody who's relatively new to the field, they're like, yeah, perfect. Yeah. As they're like, oh my God, like, what do I do? Where do I even start? And it's not like all of these choices are equal, right? Like, depending on the circumstances, some are definitely going to be better or worse, and some are just going to be bad. Like, we would all agree that there are certain situations where you should never use, a line chart for this or a bar chart for that. And so, I think that's where I see, anyways. That's the real role for taxonomies, decision trees, is to give people at least a starting point. I also agree, though, that yes, they can constrain creativity, but I think that only happens when you're more advanced, right? Like, when you have a stronger background, you developed a feel for these things, and then you can start maybe deviating from these taxonomies and trees. And they probably become less useful. Like, Amanda, you were saying, well, you find that they're not very useful for you. It's like, yes, you have years of experience, doing this, and so they're probably not that useful to you. But in the people who I kind of interact with on a daily basis, they find them extremely useful because they don't have your expertise, right? So I guess that's kind of maybe a first comment. A second is that, to be honest, maybe actually, Amanda, would I be able to share my screen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course.
When I see a lot of these taxonomies, you're right, because there's tons of them floating around out there. Here's some static ones. There's also some interactive ones. To be honest, I see issues in the ones that I've come across, and I've probably looked at least a dozen. And I think that they may be useful as kind of a brainstorming tool, but when I start to actually kind of look at them in detail, I see problems, right? Like, all of these, for example, will say that if you are just showing the simple breakdown of a total, you should use a pie chart, or a pie chart is one of the options. And I'm not against pie charts at all. But if you kind of, take a closer look at a situation like that, like, for example, if, we're trying to say, well, convey an insight, like here, Mrs. Smith contributed more than Mrs. Jones, a simple breakdown of a total, but this isn't offering enough precision to see that Mrs. Smith contributed more than Mrs. Jones, right? So in that case, actually a bar chart would be better for showing, the breakdown of a total. But if we change the insight, Mrs. Smith, contributed almost a quarter of all donations, well, now all of a sudden a pie chart is a good choice. Or, another situation might be, okay, well, same data, but different story. We want to say that Mrs. Smith and Mrs. Jones accounted for over 300K in donations. Pie chart is not necessarily a great choice here because the user is going to have to do some mental math, right? And so maybe a stacked bar chart would actually be a better case to show this simple breakdown of a total, right? And so there's a situation here where, pie chart, it would not necessarily be the best choice. Or if we have a lot of parts, once again, well, then a pie chart is not necessarily the best choice. Something like a bar chart might be a better choice, or even a Pareto chart. Or if we have a lot of parts, maybe a tree map, right? And so these are all situations where if you follow the decision trees that I've seen anyways, you'll be choosing pie charts all the time in this situation, whereas there are many circumstances where it's not necessarily the best choice. Or if you don't have all the parts, right? Here we're showing the breakdown of a total, but we're just showing our top 3 donors, right? So we don't have all the parts. This is actually a mistake, right? If you're going to show a pie chart, you have to have all the parts, right? You should use a bar chart instead. Or if we have a mix of positive and negative parts, pie charts don't work. They don't make sense, right? You have to have all positive or all negative, in which case, well, you're going to go with a bar chart or maybe even a waterfall chart. And so, or if the parts overlap, right? Well, once again, you can't use a pie chart if the parts overlap. You got to use a bar chart or some other chart type. And so really the point that I'm making is that, and I just chose pie charts as one example, but if you follow those decision trees, very often you will end up making a bad chart type choice, right? There are so many circumstances in which, like to show the breakdown of a total, for example, one of these other chart types is going to be a better choice. And that's simply not reflected in the kind of the standard kind of, not standard, but the other kind of decision trees that I've seen. Really, I think you need something like this. So this is a decision tree, but it accounts for all of those factors and others, right? And so you're actually, if you follow this, you will actually know when to use a pie chart and when to use something else. And maybe there are other tools, other decision trees, which are this kind of robust, but I haven't seen them. And that was one of the reasons why I wrote the book and I created my course, because I thought there were opportunities to kind of make it more robust. And so it's not as likely to point you into basically a wrong chart type choice. And so, by the way, when people ask like, well, when should you use a pie chart? This is my answer. If all of these conditions are met, then, yes, like there are times when pie charts are a good choice. It's just that knowing when they're a good choice just isn't as simple as the other tools that I've seen kind of make it out to be. And I've heard other people sort of describe those other tools as like, well, they're good for brainstorming, getting ideas. Sure, I can accept that. But if you're going to use them to actually choose specific chart types in specific situations, unfortunately, I think they'll often point you kind of in the wrong direction. And so I used pie charts and showing the breakdown of a total as an example, but I could say the same thing about line charts and stack bar charts, right? If you follow those other tools, you're very often going to make poor chart type choices, because unfortunately choosing a chart type just isn't that simple, right? Mm-hmm. And so in my book and my course, I actually have 9 of these decision trees for different situations, and I'm actually in the process of knitting them all together into the master decision tree. It's not done yet, and to be honest, this is more of an academic exercise because like really, if you want to use it, you probably have to print it on a big poster, because it's, that's the kind of reality. It's just,
You have a "you are here" in that diagram someplace? Something.
Sorry, what'd you say?
You are here. A little dot showing.
You start here. It's just hard.
Okay, got it. Thank you. That's the entrance.
But to be honest, like this is what I teach. I'm never going to teach the big master decision tree. It's more just kind of as a fun thing to do. Like a poster I'll put on my wall at some point. These are the useful ones, right?
Yeah, but Nick, everybody now wants to see the full version of that.
I know,
right? You realize you've shared it, and we all want that.
Now you're committed.
Version.
Now you're committed.
Yeah.
Limited edition, only 100 copies, signed by the author, and you get a copy of the book as well. You
not fully baked yet. You can see it's still pretty messy, and there's things I need to fill in. But really, the point that I'm making, I guess, is that if your decision, chart chooser tool, whatever it is, isn't at a certain level of robustness, it's not just going to be kind of a simple version. It's just very often going to point people to the wrong choices, right?
So maybe there's a kind of key piece of language here. And I mean, talking about chart selection and chart taxonomies is partially having a shared language about charts, and maybe we're conflating taxonomy, kind of these chart brainstorming tools with lots of ideas, with decision trees that say, if you say yes or no or answer these questions in different ways, we lead you down a path. because I do think that those end up functioning a little bit differently. And I think that comes out in some of the comments from folks here, like Jen, who said, I'm an experienced chart maker and I still like taxonomies. Because they remind you of other ways you might present data for sparking creativity, where you're looking at them as a brainstorming tool. And Desiree had a similar comment about helping intermediate folks get out of a rut, seeing lots of different options, and then being able to make the thoughtful decisions about what chart type to choose and what to display. And so I think there's an interesting question about language there in terms of taxonomies versus decision trees that are much more kind of path driven. And to my chart chat chums, other thoughts from your side? Taxonomies, do you use them still in your practice, Andy?
Yeah, I too discovered this in about 2008 as I was a blank canvas, not really having a clue about what charts meant, and it just blew me away. Right, so as somebody who benefited from these as a beginner, they were absolutely fascinating. And over time, what I came to realize when I kind of realized there were problems with taxonomies, it's like when you know nothing, the whole world is unclear, and then there's a point at which you know something, right? You're like, oh, I can ask this question, what would I like to show? The world is clear right now. You know the taxonomy. Sorry about this awful photograph, bad hair day. The world is clear, but then all of us here, we've now got the wisdom and the development. So ultimately, the edges got blurry. The more I know, the harder it gets. Taxonomies are kind of like almost this Victorian English approach to the world. Everything must be classified, and even taxonomies across different disciplines and biology, even everything's kind of blurry once you become an expert. And I love that, right? Amanda, you said mental model. You build your own mental model. So I acknowledge all the problems with taxonomies, but I will defend to the death the fact that they are perfect for people on their journey. And I got more militant in that when Stephen Few wrote about 3,000 words criticizing this one, the chart chooser, and yet I'm evidence that it was a fantastic tool for somebody at that point. You wouldn't give a 12-year-old War and Peace to teach them about reading. Or a 5-year-old, right? They need something like this, and then they can learn the boundaries. So I'm all in favor of taxonomies, and I can't wait to see your full one, Nick.
Great. Any quick thoughts from Steve, Jeff, how you use taxonomies? I know you both teach and do in terms of data viz work. Before we,
I don't use taxonomies, and I find the people on teams that I've had don't use taxonomies, but I think it goes to what Nick said, is those are experts, right? Those are people that build that stuff every day. And so after you do it for 5 or 10 years and you get a win, right? You say, oh, in this scenario, a tile map would work really well, and that's worked for me in the past, right? And so you see a problem and the tool sets just come to mind. That doesn't mean you don't iterate through them. You still do a lot of iterating to find what might work best in a scenario. But I don't find that I use taxonomies, but I do agree. I recognize that others on the journey may need them. And by the way, I'll point out, after Stephen Few criticized that, he does have his own graph selection matrix that he published, his own PDF of one. I think using it goes back to what Nick said. Using it as a tool for people on the journey, I think, can be really helpful. And the other thing is, what are the names of all of them, right? Like, we know the names, but you got to learn how to build it. So what do I Google? Do I Google a connected dot plot or a barbell chart or a dumbbell chart, or there's 15 different names for the same chart sometimes, and just trying to think of what the name is for that bump chart that I once heard about but I haven't built in 15 years, right? Or never built one. Then those can be really useful tools, I think.
So
Steve?
I'm deeply troubled that I hate decision trees as much as I do. And I recognize that the whole reason Nick put this together was not because he loves them. It's because he's, all right, I'm seeing people in my workshops and clients that are struggling with this, and this seems to help them. So this is a case where I have to start seeing things through somebody else's eyes, just because, here, I will share, this is the only decision tree diagram that I've ever liked and that has resonated with me completely. Got it. This is really helpful. But where there's another piece of this that I think, Nick, you do extremely well in the book, that I don't necessarily think that you need the decision tree, but you are doing as good a job if I've seen anybody answer Andy's "it depends" questions, which is, if in this case, in this context, that whole example of the 6 values and visualizing them, Jeff and I used to do in our workshops. Jeff, you may still do it. How would you visualize 37 and 75? And without context, you don't know what you should be using and why you should be using it, etc. And outside of the decision trees, which is my hang up, I have to recognize there are other people who may find that was so helpful. You get into the, well, how many lines are too many lines in a line chart? Oh, well, you may have something like this. And then again, it may be like this, or here's how you can do it. And I think the book does a wonderful job addressing that without what is, for me, the dreaded decision trees. I find them intimidating. I know that Ben Jones loves them as well and often has them in his books. So just because you don't like it or it doesn't resonate with you, meaning me, doesn't mean it isn't useful for your audience. That's something I will try to keep in mind.
Well, so Nick, and we want to make sure you kind of get the final word. So I will go back to the debate that came up in our DVS conversation from 3 years ago. And the big question was, taxonomies oversimplify and allow us to be lazy, or are useful and play a valuable role in the data viz field? And so given that dichotomy, it sounds like there's a lot of it depends, and maybe it's an or and, but any closing thoughts from you on the role of taxonomies and decision trees in our work?
Yeah. I think that it sounds like we all agree that they probably play a role, but it depends very much on, as others said, where you are in your journey, right? We are all, years into it. And so we're probably past that point. But if you're just starting out, and it's funny that, the "it depends" sort of phrase came up, because I actually talk about that in the introduction of my book, is that I've really, that was my goal, was to not say that or to say that as little as possible, because when I'm teaching, especially people who don't have a lot of experience, "it depends" or "use your judgment" is not helpful. They're like, I just haven't developed that judgment yet. I don't, I need some guardrails, right? And I think the other kind of really valuable aspect of a good taxonomy is that, I like Alberto Carver and I were talking about this the other day, and he had a great word or a great way of explaining it, which is like training wheels, right? Like when you're learning how to ride a bike, training wheels keep you from falling over. And I think taxonomies, decision trees can help do that as well, right? They can basically keep you from making, kind of pretty obvious mistakes that all of us would recognize as like, yes, you do not use a pie chart to show a mix of positive and negative values, right? We all know that, but lots of other people don't know that. And so this basically sort of a taxonomy puts guardrails in place to keep you from making those kinds of mistakes when you're a beginner. Yeah.
Yep.
So, I think we could probably dive into continuing to talk about the merits, demerits, ways in which we use these taxonomies. But I want to be mindful that we move on to our next topic, which is around inset plots. And this is where language is interesting. This was a new term for me in terms that I've seen people use and write about. You using them in your books, Nick, and others now seeming like this is a very normal term. But I've never thought of using this way of describing what is an inset plot. And so I'm going to cede it over to you to give everyone a tour as to what inset plots are and maybe how and where we might use them.
Sure. Great. Yeah, thanks. This is from my workshop, my practical charts course. And I talk about mistakes around quantitative scales. One of the mistakes that I call it a mistake anyways, is to use a broken scale. I think that these are problematic because, there we go. It's really easy for people to misread a chart like this, to think that, the East here is like 20% greater than the Central region, which of course it's not, right? We all recognize that no, because of the broken scale, it's actually not that. And so if the audience first has to notice the broken scale, they also have to understand it, right? And those are two big ifs depending on the audience. And even if the audience notices it and understands it, really what something like this says is, oh, by the way, in this chart, some of the bar lengths are wrong. Right? Don't compare some of these bar lengths with some of these other bar lengths. And it's like, thanks, right? And so I'm really not a fan of this kind of situation. I'm getting to inset charts, by the way. I'm kind of building the kind of use case for them. If we were to unbreak the scale, though, we end up with a chart like this, which may be fine, right? Like if the point is to basically say that the East is way bigger than the other regions, this isn't broken. We don't have to fix it. But of course, if we actually want to say something about how the small, values compare with one another, well, this isn't going to cut it. Oftentimes, you'll see logarithmic scales used in a situation like this, because if you switch from a linear to a log scale, one of the effects of that is it makes the smaller values larger, and so in theory it makes them easy to compare. In practice, and there's lots of studies showing that people really struggle with these to estimate values with any kind of even a remote degree of precision. Like if I were to ask you, like, what is this, right? It's kind of tough, right? 400, 800, it's actually, if you're curious, it's 451. Or how does the central region compare to the north? Is it 50% more, twice as much, 3 times as much, right? Most audiences are really going to struggle with that kind of thing. And so I don't think this is a great way of dealing with outliers. Instead, I suggest doing something like this. So this is an inset chart. And so the problem that inset charts are designed to solve is basically when you have a part of the chart where things are too small, right? And so it's hard to see. And so you just draw a box around it and then blow it up into its own kind of, blown up version of the chart. And I think this is a more graceful solution than like a broken scale or a logarithmic scale, because problems that I mentioned with those other approaches can be used with just about any chart type, right? Because you'll have the same problem with, line charts or even stacked bar charts, works just as well. Even scatter plots, you can have the same kind of issue. And to be honest, like I wish we'd seen more of this during COVID, because when we saw, a lot of case counts like this, where we were all really worried about what was happening down here. Are things going up or down? It was really hard to see, or down here. And what you mostly saw was this, right? Logarithmic scales. And again, there's lots of studies that have shown that people are just terrible at misreading it. And really things like this huge spike, are kind of lost, right? In a chart like this. And I think it probably would have been more helpful to do something like this. Right. You can really see like the differences between like how much more the cases were around this time than they were around these times, but you can still see the patterns going on here, which in this case were very meaningful, right? This is where we're sort of freaking out and wondering, like, is it going up? Is it going down? Well, you can kind of accomplish that with an inset chart.
Interesting. So chart chat chums, any thoughts from you on inset plots and the way you use them? Steve, I know you had a couple different ideas and examples around inset plots and ways to use them. Do you want to pull up your pieces?
Yeah, I'll pull up the pieces. I just wanted to issue with the logarithmic scale and used to show COVID. The ones where I thought really worked, where they were dealing with, I think, what is the root meaning of the word logarithmic, which is ratio, and the rate at which something is increasing. So the Financial Times and John Byrne Murdoch, and with the reference line showing, the number of cases that are doubling per week or tripling per week. That was the purpose of it. And that was when I was surprised to see logarithmic scales go mainstream. And it was trying to show the rate at which the thing was increasing, very different than where it's peaking and et cetera. Let me share a couple of things, which was, and I think we covered this in earlier chart chat, and Jeff explained how something like this could happen. I won't get into all the different iterations, but there was a wonderful Twitter thread on this when Mayor Eric Adams, mayor of New York City, at the end of 2021, was reporting on this huge increase in crime. And how did that happen? What's going on there? Well, in this case, it was an example of breaking the value axes. And Jeff very effectively showed, well, how could that happen innocently enough? It has to do with some fixed coding in Excel, where if the highest and lowest values are within 5/6 of each other, if I have the number right, it's going to break the value axes. So there were discussions of, well, how else might you show something like this? And this was an attempt to not just show the 5 years, but also show it in the context of a longer period. And I think my favorite example came from programmer and data visualization enthusiast. He just does this for fun, Daniel Zvinka, who came up with what I thought was a really effective inset chart. And what I like in particular is very, I can see the little box here and nothing else. Oh, this is the blow up of that little box. So I thought that was extremely well done. I'm going to defer to Jeff and Andy about a discussion of how you make something like this work on dashboards. I have some thoughts that are percolating, but I like those examples very much and thought it worked well.
Interesting.
Jeff?
Andy? Jeff?
My favorite inset chart example is Danushki de Oliveira, her Women in Cincinnati visualization when looking at the population of women in the workforce, and you look at race. She did this wonderful Zoom feature to solve that problem where white and black, just dominate, all of the data. And so then you can't see the bars for anything else. Yet you want to see it on a scale. And so I thought the zoomed in feature with the numbers worked really well in this case, even interactive, by the way, where you can, still interact on the zoom feature. I thought that worked well. As an alternative to a zoom, I thought I'd point out another favorite of mine, which was Bo McCready did this area chart, and he posted this. I recognize right off the bat, it's not the same problem, but it has a similar problem in that it's not a normalized range. And so this is in essence zoomed because each genre of the film is on a different scale. We think we're cruel in the data viz community with our feedback, by the way. He posted this to Reddit and the Reddit community just tore it apart. And, not even a data viz community, the Reddit folks. And so, his solution was to create a button at the top that if you really want to see this on a standardized range, well, you can, but you're not going to see any trend in sci-fi at all. And you're not going to see any trend in, Western at all. But, he also has a beautiful tooltip to dive into the details. And the button lets you, flip the range to be able to flip it back to see, oh, yeah, you can actually see the trends of Western over time or the musicals are going down. So I really like these. I never did call them an inset chart, but I do like, these techniques. The last one I'd mention is a problem of scale where, you have just three, it's all the same data, but three different population sizes. The people who have basic proficiency, intermediate proficiency, and advanced are all on three different scales. And I think sometimes a small multiple is a good answer to that, where again, you have a different range for each one of those people over the same time scale. But you're showing that, the advanced is really only on a scale of 1 to 7, where your basic is on a different scale of, say, 50 people. So I think those are other potential solutions to solving that problem.
Cool. Nick, I'm going to share your screen again. Is it okay to go back to one of the first inset charts that were in this deck? So I love the concept, and the examples Steve and Jeff and you've all shown are really good. Right, there you go. The challenges I have, though, are there's a couple of them. First of all, they're really hard to implement, particularly in this format. I mean, we've talked about this in the past. I'm like, how would I even build this in Tableau? I couldn't build it, certainly in that appearance. Well, yeah, I know how I do know how I could how I can do it, but it would be difficult. Certainly, getting the lines in place if I wanted to draw that zooming out. The Tableau Public example, obviously, there's a lot of work goes into it. So that forces them to be largely static things, and they won't work with ongoing live data. I also think there's an interesting cognitive challenge, which obviously I think they're quite cognitively overloading. The sort of visual hierarchy for me doesn't stand out too clearly. So it's like which bit's the foreground, which is the background. And so it'd just be interesting to explore that with people about how they actually interpret these when they see them. So those are my warnings, I guess. Nick, I'll just ask, how did you build this chart?
In PowerPoint and with cutting and pasting. So I completely agree, right? And I've heard this objection to inset charts in the past, saying like, yes, they're hard to automate, basically. Like if you have any kind of dynamic, the updating display, and totally agree. But my position is, does that mean that we shouldn't talk about them or show them? No, I think we should, because if you're creating a presentation slide or a report, a document or something, then this is absolutely doable, right? It's a little bit of cutting and pasting. You're drawing some lines. It's pretty easy. And I mentioned in the book as well, when I talk about inset charts, that, if this is limited to essentially kind of more static displays of data, I can imagine ways of actually doing this on a dashboard. It's just not going to look like this, right? You're probably going to have two separate charts. But I mean, I can imagine situations where you could at least automate sort of like the decision to even show that second chart, right? Like you using some very simple rules, you could actually detect, oh, this is a situation where an inset chart would be appropriate because there's outliers, or because all the data falls within a very narrow range. It's far from zero, for example. And then on your dashboard, you then show a second chart above or beside the first one. It's just that without these kind of lines, then and boxes and things, the relationship between the two charts is a little less clear.
Yeah, I think. I think. A really interesting thing is this user interface approach is very interesting, because there's something about the lack of box that makes it sort of more cognitively obvious. And then I think, if you were building these in presentations, then you'd probably do this in a two-stage process. You might show the whole chart and then overlay on a second click the inset, and then
like this,
just like that, right? So you introduce the chart and then you introduce the inset, and at that point the users come along with you and you haven't overloaded them in one point. But
I think this would be an interesting area of study. I don't know if there are any researchers on the call, but to look at different arrangements and, do you connect them with lines or not? Do you put boxes around the various parts or not, to help people understand the relationship between the two charts? I think that'd be a very interesting research question.
Well, and I think just as we kind of transition and talk about our last chart of our section for Chart Chat today, I think—
Hey, Amanda, I want to throw out the gauntlet to anyone that's out there and say, hey, we'd love to see how you could do this in a dynamic environment.
We would.
Dashboarding tool of your choice, if you come up with something.
Please do.
And maybe we'll send somebody a Chart Chat mug. So
I would love to more broadly kind of tile out and look at the various different user interfaces that I think in the course of just this past 10 minutes, looking at, I think at least 10 different ways to handle where do you put it? How do you embed it? Do you put a box around it, as we think about kind of principles of display around enclosure and other things that we use to tell someone that things are connected? The kind of placement of things together, white space, no white space even. There's just such an interesting different array of ways in which people have handled this from a UX perspective, even on a more static display, that I personally just find fascinating. And I think the messiness of how it feels to me when there's lots of lines and boxes is one of the things that I struggle with the most. But
and I've seen brackets, like in Jeff's example, curly brackets or curly brace to show that as well. Like very much something worth exploring.
So many things there. All right. So our last chart of the day is going to be talking about box plots and looking at box plots, and going back to one of the articles on Nightingale. Actually, that's one of our very well-read articles on Nightingale, and one that I go back to often in terms of talking about what is a box plot and what are some good alternates to a box plot if we don't want to use one. So Nick, do you want to go ahead and teach everyone in a short section what a box plot is, and share some of your thoughts about the use of box plots?
Sure. Yeah. If I can maybe just get my screen shared.
Yes, it is.
Awesome. All right. So this is a box plot. I'm not going to explain what a box plot is because it takes too long. And that's one of my concerns with box plots. I actually have a YouTube video that I made a couple of years ago, which has oddly gone fairly viral. There's 44,000 views now, that explains how to read box plots. And the first 4 minutes of that, excuse me, is the basic explanation right? Because people have to understand things like quartiles and medians, and to a lot of people, these are fairly kind of abstract concepts. And so that's kind of one of my concerns with box plots, is that a lot of people, in fact, most people, I think, don't know how to read them. When I ask in workshops, right, who knows how to read a box plot? Usually, maybe 10-20% of hands go up. And these are people who have signed up for a data visualization workshop, who have above average levels of data literacy to begin with. And so right away, that's kind of a challenge. The alternatives that if you're not sure how to read a box plot, you can just search for box plot Deborah on YouTube, and you will get my 4-minute explanation. In terms of alternatives, the ones that I typically reach for most often are strip plots. I find that they're much easier to understand. Like any chart type, they have their strengths, they have their weaknesses, right? Like I said, pretty easy to understand. They're very detailed, right? You can see individual values, which you actually generally can't see in a box plot. Limitations, though, are that it's hard to see how many values are in each bin or range. If I want to know, for example, like how many values are between 60 and 70K, I would have to maybe count dots, which is going to be a bit painful. And it doesn't really show the shape of the distribution if it's, not as well as something like a histogram anyways, where is it more kind of, sort of like a normal distribution or skewed, for example. It's a little bit harder to see. And it maxes out at a few dozen values. Otherwise, it turns into a big strip of overlapping dots, in which case you could move to a jittered strip plot, which basically has kind of the same sets of strengths and weaknesses. It's just you can show more dots by spreading them out a little bit. But this is also going to max out at, maybe a few dozen or a few hundred values, or just get big overlapping blocks of dots again. In which case you could go to a merged histogram, where you basically have multiple histograms. They're merged because they all share the same axis in this case. And then, of course, with histograms, you can go up to any number, right? You can have millions, billions of values, and that's going to work just fine. So that's a big advantage. It also shows, of course, the shapes of the distributions quite well, but a little bit more abstract, higher risks that the audience is not going to understand, or you're going to have to explain it to them. It doesn't show individual values. If I want to see, how much was the lowest paid person in this company making, I can only see a range. I can't see specific values. And it's, when the histograms are spread out like this, it's kind of hard to compare the bar heights precisely, right? To compare this bar height with this bar height. You could overlap them, making them semi-transparent, of course, which allows for very precise comparisons of bars, but you're going to be limited, of course, in terms of the number of sets that you can show, because if you have too many, if you have more than 3, really, it tends to look like a spaghetti chart, in which case you could just go back to maybe merged histograms. I also sometimes use distribution heat maps. I had to create this term because I'm not aware of one for this chart type. If anybody knows that if this chart type has a name other than distribution heat map, let me know. But I couldn't find one, so I called it a distribution heat map. And so it's basically showing distribution data, of course, as using a color gradient. I found that these tend to be a little bit easier to understand than merged histograms, because these actually kind of look like clusters, denser clusters of values, less dense clusters of values, which is kind of what's happening here. But it's not as precise as a histogram, right? Sorry, jumped ahead there, because I have to compare colors to a color gradient here. And so my precision is not going to be quite as good as in a histogram. And so if I compare box plots to these alternatives, right? Well, I find that they're just harder to understand than the alternatives that I showed. They're more prone to misinterpretation. I've seen this happen many times. And in fact, there's some research which also supports this. And they tend to conceal important distribution information. For example, if I have a box plot like this, it looks like these 2 data sets are essentially identical. But if I look at them as a jitter strip plot, I can see that actually they are not, right? And so, essentially box plots make everything look like normal, Gaussian distributions, even if they're not, right? Even if they're more kind of lumpy or uneven distributions. And so they have all these disadvantages, and I'm just not seeing a lot of advantages, which is why I just don't recommend using them anymore. And so that was kind of the gist of my article in Nightingale, which took me 3 days to respond to all of the emails and tweets and messages that I got around this. It seemed to have triggered a nerve.
Well, I think that you've just given a tour through the ways in which you can take one very specific set of data and visualize it. Was that 8, 9? How many different ways?
Yeah, and I have a decision tree for that too in the book if you want.
But I think it's an interesting way to kind of walk through and talk about the ways in which some of our much more standardized chart types that we might go to, because they're what we were taught in grad school or wherever else, don't always communicate the way we expect. Jeff, if I remember, did you have some pointed thoughts about box plots from your experience?
Oh, muted?
Muted, yeah, I think so.
Sorry, technical issue, my fault. I do have some thoughts on that, and I can't say that I disagree with what Nick has shared with us. I do acknowledge the things that he's talked about. I guess, when I think about advantages of box plots over other charts, Nick mentioned, the one downside to a dot plot with jitter, you can't put 1 billion people in China on a dot plot, right? So I think that's one issue. The overlapping works really well in many instances, where, you got dots on top of each other. This is life expectancy of a female by countries. There are 46 red dots on top of each other, and you can't see that. By adding, a jitter function in here, random, and splitting those things apart, that's easier to see. So certainly, I think that's a better view. Where the box plot comes into play for me is when I add a box plot to this on life expectancy, what I can easily see is outliers, because I can see things that are out at, past the deviations. I mean, the outliers just really jump out at me. And so I think that's a useful thing in there that the histograms and dot plot with jitters and other chart types don't show. That said, I'll acknowledge there's other ways to find outliers besides just using box plots. But for individual points, and if there are too many points to show, especially, I mean, somebody mentioned this in Tableau, when you edit this in Tableau, it really does a good job. I mean, you can hide the underlying points. You can just show the outliers. And so I think that helps too. It's like if there's 1 million points and you just want to focus on the outliers, I think that's an interesting use of them as well. So I do find them useful, but I would never use it for a general audience. I mean, I'd certainly only use it for somebody who, my data science team would certainly know how to read a box plot. So I wouldn't have any problem, putting it out there. But I don't think I'd be the front page of the New York Times, which, they got away with, right? If we think about the New York Times did a dot plot with jitter, put 500,000 dots on the front page of the New York Times for COVID. I don't think that would have worked as a dot plot. I mean, a box plot. I think that is interesting. So.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting set of points about some of the pros and cons, and love bringing up the idea of what the different tools do in terms of how they treat things. Being mindful of time, Steve, you want to pull up your kind of closing thoughts on box plots before we pivot over to our wrap up?
I'll make it fast, which is I think you left out one of my favorites, and it's I kind of got inspired looking at this, working with Jeff Shaffer. People know I hate box plots, but I will try to make it brief, which is the unit histogram or Cleveland dot plot. And here's the same thing with the jitter and just all the explorations of I think Jeff suggested combining the box plot with the unit histogram and some overlapping with it, maybe doing it as just the histogram, but I'd like seeing the separate dots that were there. Then, of course, Dan Zvinka weighs in with different ways to show this as well. But I might add it as another tool in one's toolbox or an arrow in your quiver.
Well, and there's some great debate over the merits, demerits, and people's just gut feel about violin plots that maybe we can take over into the after party if folks are joining us there. But I do want to be mindful of time with wrapping up for today. We'll bring our one lightning round item up. Steve, did you have a lightning round item you wanted to share with us?
Sure, I'll make it. There were just two delightful things that I saw. One was, I think, in yesterday's or the days before, New York Times, the nation's top performing public school system. And I just love this chart showing the improvement or degradation of schools, different state schools compared with the Department of Defense, which maintains its own education system. And maybe because this is my go-to to presenting this type of data, that's why I like it so much, which is an arrow chart, colored and pointing in particular directions. So I thought this was a very clear and effective way to show it. People are welcome to weigh in, but I need to be mindful of time. And the other is just very quick. If you are not following this practitioner, you should be. Oriane Gauthier, who I believe is the head of the information lab in France. And I'm just blown away at what he quietly produces on a normal cadence, really thoughtful, well-designed concepts in data visualization and design. So if you're not following this guy, you should. And I really like that New York Times visualization to show the change of school performance over time.
Fabulous. And over the course of the kind of session today, we've been able to kind of dig into some of the ways in which Nick teaches and shares information. You'll find in his book lots of similar annotations with all the little annotation layers on top of the charts and graphs, giving you insights around what's working and what's not. Maybe a little bit different than the scaredy cat, but still effective in terms of telling us about what it is that's working or not working on different charts. Before we dive into our wrap-up slides, Nick, anything you want to share with the community and with our viewers as we wrap up today in terms of key takeaways or anything about your upcoming book?
Oh, well, I just had a chart to feature that I really liked.
Let's see it.
I tried to track down the original last night, which is from John Byrne Murdoch in the Financial Times, but I couldn't find it. So I just kind of recreated it. I mean, I don't want to get into the debate of dual axis charts, but if for some reason you wanted to use one, he did a really interesting thing here, I thought, with the axis or the grid lines, right? Because this is something in a dual axis chart that you always struggle with, right? You know, because oftentimes the labels don't line up with the labels here. And so he basically kind of faded the grid lines out in either direction. And that brings even more attention to the fact that this is essentially two charts that have been kind of merged or overlapped into one. And I thought this was incredibly clever. I'm still not completely sold on this kind of safety of using dual axis charts, but I thought that this was a really, really brilliant way of handling it. But like I said, I want to give full credit to John because this was very much his idea. But I was impressed by this, this grid line effect.
I actually really like the offsetness of them that caused me to further kind of take a pause and say, this is not aligning to each other. I think that's one of the pieces of beef I often have with dual axis charts is when all the lines line up and mean different things.
Yeah.
I know what the Tableau community will be doing this afternoon, trying to figure out
is how to get faded grid lines in Tableau, part one.
When someone comes up with that solution, please share it somewhere, maybe on LinkedIn, because I don't really pop onto X all that much, Twitter X anymore.
Parameterize the offset of the grid lines as well.
All right. Well, now that everyone has their afternoon work ahead of them in terms of their challenges for what to play with in that space, let's go ahead and wrap up Chart Chat number 45. Thank you so much, Nick, for you joining us today. It was great to get to hear from you and to dive into some of these interesting and practical topics. There's a couple interesting things coming up. We've got our Chart Chat in November scheduled out, and it's going to be a good one. We're going to move from practical charts over to charts for the movies. Andy, want to share a little bit about what we have coming up for November and your additional items that you've got coming up?
Yeah, absolutely. So Sean Yue is a UX designer for many Hollywood movies, including this one, Skyfall, as well as Batman, Prometheus, Avengers movies. He's done a whole lot, and he knows a lot about how to make data look sexy or look cinema worthy. So we're going to talk about the challenges and the opportunities there. So that's November the 30th. We have a date. It's great. Timing is going to be a little bit different, so keep your eye on the registration. Secondly, I'm continuing my exploration with ChatGPT's advanced data analysis plugin. Can it actually do real-world data analysis? That's going to come up on Tuesday, 17th of October on my YouTube channel, which I brilliantly don't have a link to. But can AI actually do real data analysis? On the first example, probably not. And it is Tableau's IronViz season. Yes, till the end of the month. You can share your IronViz entries and maybe get a chance to be on the big stage in San Diego. But really, it's not about the winning. It's about the taking part and learning. There you go. That's me. Thank you.
There you go. From our side within DVS, we have the Information is Beautiful Awards coming up at the early November 3rd and 4th. This is a celebration of great work in data visualization, and the event is open and available to the public to join. Both the mini conference on Friday, a day of inspiration, hearing from shortlistees about the making of their shortlisted works with a couple great keynotes that we're going to be announcing this week. And then also joining us for the awards ceremony, a brunch party on Saturday, allowing our European colleagues to join the live stream and hear the winners live. So would love to see some of you at that event. I'll be there in Baltimore, Maryland, but would also love to see you there online if you're joining us online. Steve, you've got workshops coming up, yeah?
Yes, last public workshop this year, November 14th and 15th, 2 half-day sessions. And who knows, maybe we'll be discussing how to add inset charts into your dashboards at that point. I've got a full month to figure it out and see if it's worthwhile. And if you could put the URL for that up, bigpig.me/dashboards23. If you or anyone else could benefit, hope to see you there.
Excellent. And as always, you can find workshops, recordings, resources all on the bigbookofdashboards.com. You can find everything that you need to know about Chart Chat on chartchat.live. And we always love having more folks getting excited about everything from practical charts over into the world of crazy movie visualizations, joining us within the Data Visualization Society, where we like to celebrate, nurture, and advance the field of data visualization. So this is the moment when we go ahead and we close out our live stream and we open up our Zoom meeting and welcome you to come join us and share your thoughts, feelings, points of inspiration, and maybe your Tableau solutions, if you've already answered that question, on the after party. So Steve has already hopped off. You've seen him opening up that Zoom link to go ahead and join us for the after party at bigpic.me/after. You'll find us there, hanging out there for the next 30 minutes, and we hope that some of you will join us live to continue the conversation there. Nick, thank you so much for a wonderful conversation, all the great insights. I'm now really rethinking my framing of taxonomies and decision trees as the same thing. And so excited to continue the conversation and to have more folks dig into your book. With that, we'll go ahead and we're going to sign off for Chart Chat number 45 today. And we hope to see you all again in November 30th, talking all about movie visualizations. We'll see you later.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks for